Hello, beautiful people, and welcome! Hi! To the Skirk pre-release analysis! Throughout the beta, Skirk hasn't gone through any major number changes, but she's had a few mechanic changes that have been very, very impactful to her power. So, we got a bunch of stuff to talk about today. First off, though, as usual, we go through base stat stuff. Base HP, 12,417. Base defense, 806. Skirk is an on-field carry. Cryo sword user, by the way. These defensive stats for an on-fielder are enough that she's not going to feel particularly squishy. Base attack, 359. This is the highest in the game, tied with Mika, I think. Crit damage, Ascension. Now, usually I talk about how base attack in a vacuum doesn't mean that much because a character's damage when they're an attack scaler is gonna depend on their base attack, sure, but also on their talent values. In Skirk's case specifically, base attack matters a little bit more than usual. Not in terms of her overall power level, but in terms of what weapons are good for her. It doesn't really matter that much directly, but the fact that she has fairly high base attack, paired with the fact that she doesn't really have access to flat attack buffs in her teams, often make attack percent buffs a little bit more impactful on her than they are on other characters. Anyways, the main thing to remember when it comes to Skirk's kit is that you cannot play her in a melt team. It doesn't explicitly say Skirk is not allowed to be played in a melt team, but it heavily implies it. There are two main mechanics in Skirk's kit that heavily incentivize you to play freeze team. One is her Ascension 4 passive that significantly increases her numbers based on how many characters you have that are able to deal hydro or cryo damage while being hydro or cryo characters. So what I mean by that is a cryo infusion from Chongyun or a hydro infusion from Candace won't let your Mika count for that. It has to be a cryo or a hydro character. On top of that, at a baseline, she doesn't have ICD that's particularly favorable for reactions, which means that you really just want to accept this. If you were to try to play her in a melt team, instead of the 170% multiplier for your normal attacks, you'd be stuck either at nothing, 110 or 120, and just that is already enough to offset what you're gaining from melt, and that's without taking into account the rest of the things that incentivize freeze in her kit or the power of Escoffier. Anyways, so her passive, based off the amount of hydro and cryo characters you have on your team, increases normal attack damage. It's not actually normal attack damage, it's normal attack damage during her uptime. It doesn't increase her damage when she's not in her uptime. We'll talk about her uptime later, but the reason I'm mentioning this is just so that you understand that this will not increase her cryo-infused normal attacks if you use her with Chongyun. Alright, it's only gonna work on this skill infusion. But yeah, by 110, 120, 170, and obviously the gap between 120 and 170 is massive, so you really want to get all three stacks. She has the same passive on her burst with different numbers. I don't really know why they gave it different numbers. It's 105, 115, 160. And next is the other passive, which is the other reason why you really want to play her in freeze teams. When party members trigger frozen, superconduct, cryo swirl, or cryo crystallize reactions against opponent, a void rift will be created near this opponent. This event can be triggered once every 2.5 seconds. 3 void rifts created by Skirk can exist on the field at once. Each void rift absorbed grants her Serpent Subtlety, which is her energy mechanic, and without any form of void rift generation, Skirk is just a lot worse. She will need to use her skill twice to get burst instead of only once when you're doing burst focus Skirk, and she will only have around 7 seconds of uptime if you do the normal attack mode instead of upwards of 12 to 13. Basically, there's 3 possibilities when it comes to Skirk. Either you're playing her in a freeze team that maximizes her passive like this, you're playing her in a melt team, or you're playing her in a team that's got some, I don't know, other reactions for some reason. If you play her in a melt team, you don't get this passive or this passive, and that's just you're losing out on too much. And so the melt reaction plus the upside of being able to use characters like Bennett, unfortunately, are not enough to make up for it, and those teams are just not very good. Second option is you play in a team that does still get some void rifts, but is not a freeze team. But the thing is, outside of the melt stuff and the pyro units, the upside you get from those other units is just a lot smaller. And so while sure, you lose out on less because you still get full uptime and full energy generation for the burst mode, you also gain less from the units themselves. And finally, there's the option of playing her in freeze, which is honestly what you should always do. From what I've looked at, it's actually so blatant that C2 Shilonen is like a side grade to Mika in her teams. if you don't have Escoffier and you want a healer for Furina. Alright, and this is not me saying Mika's good. This is me saying you're coping on anything other than Mono Freeze. Anyways, last passive, when you're playing a Mono Freeze team, all party members' skill level is increased by 1. The strong units in freeze teams are mainly Escoffier and Furina, and those are 2 units that do most of their damage from skill. So skill level matters on them. But also, Skirk herself, while she doesn't do skill damage, her normal attacks that she does in her uptime have their numbers on the skill talent. And so basically, this is to say that her increasing skill talent by 1 is actually good, and it's actually impactful. Next, we can talk about the actual talents themselves. So normal attack talent doesn't matter. We don't need to look at it. It's bad. They are not good enough to ever really justify using them, especially when you compare them to the skill numbers. Elemental skill Havoc Warp imitates the combat style of the Foul, produces different effects depending on whether you tap or hold. Tap, Skirk gains 45 Serpent Subtlety, which again is her energy mechanic, and switches to 7-phase flash mode. We'll talk about what that is, but that's basically her normal attack uptime mode. Hold, Skirk gains 45 Serpent Subtlety and will continuously move at high speed. Her interruption resistance is increased in this state. During this time, Skirk can control her movement direction, blah blah blah. This sounds like an exploration ability, and like technically it kind of is, but it's also not. One thing you may have noticed if you're smart and observant is that the hold does not say anywhere that she switches to 7-phase flash mode. That means that if you want to generate energy without switching to the normal attack uptime, you have to use your hold. The reason why this matters a lot is because when your 7-phase flash mode ends, all remaining Serpent Subtlety gets removed. Well, that means that if you tap skill and swap out, you just lose all your Serpent Subtlety. What does the 7-phase flash mode in and of itself do? Well, it gives you a cryo infusion and it makes your normal attacks hit more. And when I say more, I don't mean a little bit more. I mean a lot. Keep in mind, these numbers are all multiplied by 1.7 from her Ascension passive. Good point of reference for people who aren't too familiar with what sort of motion value characters usually have is Wriothesley. Wriothesley's skill is actually also very similar to Escoffier's passive. It multiplies the normal attack damage by 1.7 basically. So you can take a look at what his normal attack string is. And as you can see, Skirk is double that. If you've been following any sort of Escoffier TC, you'll know that in Escoffier teams, Wriothesley ends up being often pretty close to a quarter of the damage, and the damage is pretty evenly split between him, Yelan, Furina, and Escoffier. And so a character that's just outright doing double his damage is gonna change the way the team behaves, for sure. Now, it's not actually double damage, right? You can't just compare motion value 1-to-1. They're gonna end up with stat lines that are different. Wriothesley, for example, gets 30% attack from his passive, has a bit less base attack, whatever. But looking at the effective attack you'll get, it's actually going to be fairly similar between Skirk and Wriothesley. Anyways, her uptime in her skill is capped at 12.5 seconds, but that doesn't mean that you get to 12.5 by default, because staying in her skill consumes Serpent Subtlety, her energy mechanic. What that means is that if you don't generate enough Serpent Subtlety, you don't get 12.5 seconds. You consume 7 per second when you get 45 from using the skill itself. So by default, you have like 6 seconds, 6.5. And in order to make it last longer, to reach that 12.5 seconds, you need to generate and absorb Void Rifts through her passive. She has 2 ways of absorbing Void Rifts. Technically, it's 3 ways, but the third way isn't something she does in the normal attack mode, and we'll talk about the burst mode later. First, when she does a charge attack during her skill, and second, when she uses the special burst. Skirk has a special burst, kind of like Verissa, that you can use under a specific condition. In Verissa's case, you can use the special burst after an enhanced plunge. In Skirk's case, you can use the special burst at any time during her skill, like normal attack uptime. It doesn't cost any Serpent Subtlety, but what it gives you is very small. All it gives you is it gives you a little bit more normal attack damage percent based off of how many Void Rifts are on the field when you use it. But the main reason you use it is because there are Void Rifts on the field and you get to absorb them. Skirk's charge attack in her skill, 88.1 times 3, it's less than 300, but it doesn't get multiplied by 1.7 by this passive. And so doing a charge attack is not good. You don't want to do charge attacks unless you have to do them. And because of that, the special burst is going to be worth using because you get to consume your Void Rifts and generate your Serpent Subtlety without having to use the bad charge attack. You can have up to 3 rifts at once, and you will hopefully be generating 3 rifts during your setup, and if you do, you get 24 additional Serpent Subtlety, which isn't actually enough to get you to the upper limit of time, but it is enough, right, 10 seconds, to be pretty reasonable. That being said, if you have buffs that last longer than 10 seconds, you can also consider adding a charge attack later on in your rotation to absorb whatever void rifts you generated during your uptime, and maybe you get an additional 2 or 3, and you're gonna have enough to reach that 12-ish second. That's pretty much it for the normal attack mode, but you may have noticed I said very often normal attack mode. That's because Skirk can choose how she uses her Serpent Subtlety. You can either use it in the normal attack mode, or you can use it to burst. If you use it to burst, you won't have any Serpent Subtlety left for the normal attack mode. And if you use it for the normal attack mode, you can't use the actual burst during your skill, and your Serpent Subtlety gets completely cleared at the end of your skill, so you clearly won't be able to use the burst. So what is the alternative? What is that burst mode? When Skirk has at least 50 Serpent Subtlety, and notice, 50 is more than 45, so she can't use the burst just from doing a hold skill. You need to do a hold skill and have that hold skill absorb Void Rift, or do 2 hold skills. She can expend all her Serpent Subtlety to unleash her elemental burst, ripping the space before her apart and using rapid consecutive slashes that deal AoE cryo damage. At the same time, the damage dealt by an instance of this elemental burst will be increased by every point of Serpent Subtlety over 50 up to 12. This is a massive deal. By default, with exactly 50 Serpent Subtlety points at talent level 9, her burst base motion value is about 1300. That also gets increased by her passive, by 60%, not 70%. But as you can see, that burst is the equivalent of less than 1 normal attack string. But, like I said, it gets increased by Serpent Subtlety. Each point of Serpent Subtlety increases each individual hit. You have a total of 6 hits, and they get increased by 32.85 for each point. And when you cap that out at a total of 62 Serpent Subtlety or more, it takes that burst from 2200 motion value to 6000. How does that compare to the normal attack mode? Well, in order to compare one to another, we need to look at how many normal attacks you can get through her window. I'll need to test how easy it is to get her respective combos, and so take this following part with a grain of salt because there might be some changes based off of early testing. For now, from what I've looked at, since you need to do a mini burst or a special burst to absorb your first set of Void Rifts and a charge attack to absorb your second set of Void Rifts, you can't just normal attack spam, but as long as you're including 1 special burst and 1 charge attack, you'll be able to max out her uptime. And if you max out her uptime, from what I've seen, what you should be expecting is, by default, 3 full normal attack strings, right? So you get to the 5th normal attack 3 times, and then you start a 4th one and you get to the 3rd normal attack. I have seen footage that gets more than that, especially if you do dash cancel after your 5th normal attack, and you can also dash cancel the charge attack. The highest I've seen for N5 combos is 4 N5s without any attack speed, but it seems really difficult to do reliably. So for now, I'm just gonna assume 3 full combos and then 1 N3, right? So 3 N5s, 1 N3. A little bit over 9,000 motion value. So it's a bit more than 50% more than the burst. Here's the thing to keep in mind though. The skill lasts for about a little bit over 12 seconds with a cooldown of 8 seconds. In practice, this is generally going to lead to rotations that last about 22 seconds, 21 to 22 seconds, if you do them properly. The burst has a cooldown of 15 seconds. What that means is that just in terms of the motion value you get per second, the normal attack mode and the burst mode are actually incredibly close to one another. This is actually really significant because it means that Skirk is actually going to be viable in both of her playstyles, which is a pretty big deal. It effectively means that she's going to have more flexibility. She'll be able to be played as a burst support in freeze teams, just like she'll be able to be played as a carry. Now, again, just from the motion value, it can be a little bit difficult to get a good feel for how strong a character is. So, Skirk burst motion value around 6,000. We can compare that to Ayaka. Ayaka's burst, 191% on each hit, 19 hits, and then 286 on top of that from the final hit. It actually does about 50% more damage than Ayaka's burst. Does that mean she's 50% stronger than Ayaka? No. While Ayaka burst is doing less damage, she also has skills, and her normal attacks when she uses her burst are not worthless, whereas Skirk's normal attacks in the burst mode are completely dodgy. But there's also the fact that Skirk's rotations can happen faster because it's a shorter cooldown. That Skirk herself has no ER requirements because her energy mechanic is not actual energy, and she generates herself on her own kit, so she doesn't need to build any ER. That against the fact that Ayaka gets additional damage from normal and charge attacks and skills, and Ayaka has better synergy with Shenhe, makes it so that the actual gap in performance between Skirk and Ayaka is not 50%. But I'd say that Skirk still seems like she's gonna win out in her burst mode over Ayaka in burst focus teams. One important thing here though is that Skirk's cryo application in the burst mode is bad. Her skill itself does not apply cryo. What applies cryo from the skill is the cryo infusion on normal attacks. So when you do hold skill, you don't get any cryo from that. And the burst doesn't have damage over time, and she doesn't have an infusion if she does the hold version. So if you do burst mode Skirk, you get 6 cryo hits per rotation, and that's it. As we've seen lately, they're doing a lot more matchup-specific enemies, and if you look at the enemy that's meant to incentivize cryo, you need a lot of cryo to deal with them, and unironically, one cryo with Escoffier, for example, is not actually enough. There we go. Right, so if you just look at one cryo, as you can see, we don't actually do it fast enough. It's not even enough to break even. And this guy has like infinite resistances, while this thing is above a certain amount, right? And you need to bring it down a lot for his resistances to go back down, right? As you can see now, we're doing 20k instead of 1500 from bringing the thing back down. What that means is that you will just outright not be able to use Skirk as a burst-focused unit unless you also bring a third cryo against this guy. Because Escoffier's cryo by itself is not enough, and Skirk isn't giving you any cryo at all. The normal attack mode does hit with cryo more often, but you're hitting with cryo with your main source of damage, and if you notice, it starts with like about a quarter of the bar, of the circle, whatever, filled out, and you need to reduce it a decent amount before the resistances fall back down. And so, whereas Ayaka would be able to just do skill, normal charge attack, dashes to reduce that meter before using burst, Skirk will have to waste some of her damage on infinite resistances. And so just because numbers-wise, Skirk is arguably a major upgrade over Ayaka, that doesn't necessarily make her a major upgrade in practice. The next thing to look at is what happens if you try to do both? What if you do your setup normally, you do a normal attack mode, rotation is over, wait 8 seconds, start your next setup, but this time, instead of entering the normal attack mode, you do a burst, and then you immediately go into another setup and go for a normal attack mode again 8 seconds later. It won't work with every unit, because some units have buffs that don't last that long, but that's another option you'll be able to do. You'll be able to do a hybrid playstyle. I think it's a little bit more complicated, so I don't think that many people are actually going to do that, but what you'll notice is that there are going to be quite a few situations in practice where even if your team is built around normal attacks, you're going to want to do the burst. And there's going to be a few situations the other way around too, but it's mostly using burst on normal attack focus teams that you'll end up doing. First and most obvious one is in Abyss, Skirk starts with full Serpent Subtlety. So you've got two options. Either you just completely waste it and enter your tap mode and do a normal rotation, or you just do a burst before your tap mode and then enter tap mode, and your burst is going to be on cooldown, so you won't be able to use the mini burst. But if you lose out on the 20-ish damage percent you get from the burst, it's really not that big of a deal. You can just replace it with a charge attack. You'll still get your Serpent Subtlety. All you're missing out on is that little bit of damage percent. And in exchange for missing out on 20 damage percent, you get additional damage equal to 2/3 of what you were doing. It's a pretty big deal. That means in her first rotation, in the very first chamber, Skirk is kind of crazy. Like, Mawika level damage. The problem is, you can't get that again afterwards, because your skill clears your Serpent Subtlety whenever it ends. There is, however, two main situations that might occur where you will still be able to get a first rotation that's Omega buffed with the burst on the second chamber, or in other situations. Right, so the first situation is, I don't know, let's say I can do 2 million damage in my whole rotation. The enemy has 2.5 million HP. I do a rotation, he's now at 500k HP. I don't have to do a full rotation to kill this enemy now. I can just swap to Furina, use my skill, swap to Escoffier, use my skill, swap to, I don't know who your third unit is gonna be, maybe it's Mualani, because you're kind of smart and pog. Whatever, you get your Cinder City, and then you swap to Skirk and you just hold E. And instead of using your burst or using your tap E, you just use your hold E and absorb the Void Rifts, get to 45 plus however you get from Void Rifts. If it's plus 24, you're now above 62. But from what I understand, as of the latest version of beta, her Serpent Subtlety gets cleared at the end of the chamber if you're in the top skill, but it does not get cleared if you're not in the top skill, in the skill. And so if you finish the chamber, like with using Skirk's hold E and going above 62 Serpent Subtlety, and then just looking at them while Furina and Escoffier finish them off, you will be able to start that second chamber with your burst, like you were able to on the first chamber. That means if you're willing to reset, you'll be able to do it on each chamber individually, on across different clears. But also, if you know that one of the chambers is more difficult than the others, you can just make sure that you start with your burst for that chamber. That's the first situation. The second situation is enemies stalling. There's a lot of enemies that have mechanics during which they're either invulnerable or very resistant to damage. When that happens, doing your rotation doesn't really do that much. When you wait for the PMA to spawn the robots, for example, attacking it doesn't do anything. And so if your timing lines up well, you can use that stalling period to generate Void Rifts and then use Skirk's hold E and have a burst ready even in the middle of your chamber, not on the first rotation. In other words, she can use enemies' stalling mechanics as a way to store more damage in her next rotation. These two factors are really, really difficult to account for when it comes to calculations. What that means is that Skirk is a character that is likely to perform in practice pretty noticeably better than she does in calcs, in sims, in sheets, whatever. And that introduces a lot of uncertainty when it comes to her power. But the thing is, even when you just look at the calcs, Skirk already looks fairly strong. And that, along with all of the potential ways she can cheat out more damage, make me expect her to be one of the stronger carries for sure. I guess we can also quickly talk about Constellations before we get into the gearing stuff. Okay, we got Skirk's C1 leaked before we got her numbers, and initially I was like, my goodness, this is kind of broken. But now that we have the numbers, it's not actually as good as I expected it to be. Basically, 500 additional motion value for every Void Rift absorbed by default is kind of really good, but Skirk's numbers are already so good that comparatively, it's not as big of an upgrade as I expected before her kit was revealed. And it's also worth mentioning that her kit does not offer her a single stat steroid. What makes Skirk powerful is very big motion value, very high multipliers on her talents. She doesn't have any self-attack buffs, any self-crit buffs, any self-damage percent buffs, just really, really high motion value. And so this 500 on her isn't as good as 500 on most other carries. So 500 motion value on every Void Rift absorbed. What that means is that if you're doing burst rotations, because you're capped out at 3, it's generally 1500 more motion value to that burst. This plus 1500. But technically, if you're doing weird asynchronous rotations where you use your hold skill off cooldown every 8 seconds, it'll end up being more than 1500 and closer to 2000, maybe even 2500 per rotation. It's a pretty nice thing. If you do the normal attack mode, you generally have either 2 or 3 Void Rifts when you use your burst at the start of your rotation, and then another 2 or 3 when you use a charge attack in the middle. Most of the time it's going to be 5. You might want to adjust your rotation at C1 so you can absorb Void Rifts at the very end of your uptime as well. Maybe end up getting 6 or maybe 7. It effectively means that this 9000 goes up to somewhere between 11 and 1200 or 12,000. But yeah, in terms of percentage increase, this is a pretty solid C1. But one thing you might notice, or you might have noticed from what I've talked about so far, is that, well, Skirk is a freeze unit. He really wants to be played in freeze teams, and the very good freeze supports all have personal damage. Furina and Escoffier have a good amount of personal damage, and what that means is that increasing Skirk's damage by, I don't know, 30% does not increase your team DPS by anywhere close to 30%. It'll be like half of that. And because of that, even though for her personal damage, her C1 is, I'd say, arguably one of the strongest C1s we've had, because her team damage distribution is a lot more split than if you look at a Melt Mika team, for example. It's not actually the strongest C1 we've seen, but it's a fairly strong one. C2, she gets 10 more Serpent Subtlety when she uses her skill, and then she gets an additional effect for both of her modes. On the burst mode, it increases the limit that you can get from the Serpent Subtlety from 12 stacks to 22 stacks, and you get that plus 10 on top of that, so it's basically just plus 10 stacks of Serpent Subtlety, which takes this 6,000 and brings it to 9,000. But it's not actually a 50% here, because you're also gaining what you got from the C1, so it goes from 7,500 to 10,500-ish. But it's pretty impactful for the burst mode. For the normal attack mode, it's a bit less impactful. It gives her 70% attack, just full stop. That's not as good as that massive motion value increase, but it's not bad either. C3, Havoc Ruin is the burst, right? Yeah. So her Constellations, at least the early Constellations, are more impactful for the burst mode than they are for the normal attack mode, but they're not bad for the normal attack mode either. C4 is just a bit more attack. In the freeze teams, it's 40% more attack. Again, more impactful for the burst mode because the burst mode doesn't already get 70% attack from the C2 and instead gets motion value. C5, skill bonuses. C6, it's one of the good C6s. Like it just adds a bunch of motion value to her stuff, both modes. Not that much to say about it. It's a pretty good one. Overall, Skirk Constellations are fairly strong. Like, they're definitely on the stronger side. But also keep in mind that the early cons for Escoffier and Furina are also pretty good. So if what you're looking at is vertical investment on Skirk, you have a lot of options. There's unlikely to be any one specific thing that's going to be all that much better than your other alternatives for your team DPS. All right, now it's time to do what we do on every pre-release: weapons, artifact sets, artifact stats, and teams. And fair warning, there's going to be one team. It's going to be freeze. It's just going to be a matter of which units we use in freeze. But before we get to that, let's talk about the weapons. First, let's talk about her signature weapon. Within 12 seconds after a skill, attack is increased by 24%. This is a generic part. Most characters will be able to get that. 24% is pretty good for a generic stat. And then for Skirk specifically, during this time, when the equipping character has 0 energy, attack will be further increased by 24% and crit damage will be increased by 40%. There is a chance that these stats are snapshotable, and because of that, some characters will be able to get the full effect on their burst, but I don't really expect it to be. So it effectively means that for Skirk and Skirk alone, instead of 24% attack, this passive is 48% attack and 40 crit damage. Skirk's base attack is 359, so your total base attack is going to be a bit over 1,000 with this weapon. 48% attack is about 500. I want to contextualize this with Homa. You never play Hu Tao without Furina anymore. So how much HP would you need on your Hu Tao for Homa's passive to just give as much attack as Azurelight gives Skirk? You would need 62,000. And that's without even counting the 40 crit damage. Yeah, this weapon does a lot. Silver lining is that Skirk's free-to-play options are actually really good. And because of that, despite her weapon arguably being like the strongest stat stick in the game, for her specifically, not that like general stat stick, but whatever, the gap between her SIG and free-to-play weapons is actually not that different than it is on other characters because her free-to-play options are so good. Next up is Jade Cutter. And unfortunately, in order to talk about Jade Cutter properly, we need to talk about artifact sets. Skirk is a Craw character that forces you to play freeze teams. That means you'll get Craw resonance against enemies that are either enemies you can freeze, or when you use her in teams that don't have that much hydro application, you will get upwards of 15% crit rate from that Craw resonance. On top of that, her best artifact set is not her signature set, it's actually Maréchaussée, which means you're also gonna get a bunch of crit rate from your artifact set. If you get Craw resonance, you get Maréchaussée, and you get Jade Cutter, you're at 100% crit rate before you look at a single substat of crit rate. What that means is that crit rate becomes worse than flat defense as a substat, which means that your overall build quality is going to be much lower. You now have one less useful stat you're scaling with. Does that mean Jade Cutter is complete dog shit? No. What it means is that with Jade Cutter, you won't be able to use her best artifact set, and instead, on Jade Cutter, her best set will be the signature set. And because the signature set is worse than Maréchaussée, it means that you're not getting the full value from Jade Cutter. Because of that, Jade Cutter is actually not that amazing of a stat stick, but it's not an awful one either. Next up is Mistsplitter. Skirk gets every stack from Mistsplitter because the conditional stack, at least in the latest version of beta, on energy being less than 100, it works on Skirk. Skirk's energy being 0, 0 out of 0 counts as less than 100 with the way they coded it. Which means she gets full value out of this. She gets 24 damage percent. But guess what, man? This weapon came out in, what, 2021? And like I said, a 5-star weapon power creep is massive. This weapon is giving her as many stats as it's giving Ayaka, but despite that, it's pretty similar to Jade Cutter, actually. The biggest upside of Mistsplitter is that it's a crit damage weapon, which means you get to use Marechaussee. Next up is Haran. Haran, 12% damage, another 40% damage, so it's 52 damage percent. It's just outright a better passive than Mistsplitter, but it's a crit rate weapon, which means you might end up in having the same problem as you have on Jade Cutter, which brings it in line pretty much with Jade Cutter and Mistsplitter. Next is the crit stat sticks that just don't have particularly great stat lines or effects. So for example, Absolution only gives you 20 crit damage on her. This might sound decent, but keep in mind, 20 crit damage most of the time is worse than 20 attack, like 20% attack. There's a reason why circlets give you 62.2 crit damage, not 46.6. Stat allocation in Genshin generally has crit rate and crit damage at 1 to 2, and attack stands in between the two of them, about halfway there, in between, at like 1.5. Now, even though crit is generally a more favorable stat, you'd rather get 31 crit rate than 46 attack. Does that mean you'd rather get 23 crit rate over 46 attack? Not necessarily, right? Same for crit damage. Would you rather get 46 attack or 46 crit damage? At a baseline in most situations, unless you're starting to include a lot of attack buffs externally, like Banat, for example, 20% attack is generally just going to be better than 20 crit damage. What that means is that Absolution, 20 crit damage, is actually not that good of a passive. You also have Uraku Misugiri, which is 16 damage percent. It's alright. You have Splendor of Tranquil Water that outright just doesn't have a useful passive. And you have LoFi that is 4% crit rate. Uraku and Absolution, if you already have them, are slightly better than the free-to-play options. In Uraku's case, that's assuming you don't burst though, because if you burst, the normal attack damage isn't doing anything for you. So it actually is kind of just worse. For Absolution, at least it's also there on the burst. They're like 1 to 2% better than the free-to-play option, basically. So it's an incredibly small difference. And then LoFi and Splendor are outright just worse than your craftable. And so even if you have them, the only reason to use them is because you don't want to level up the craftable if you don't have it leveled already. The Summit Shaper is outright just a better weapon than these four on Skirk. If you're not shielded, it's pretty similar to Uraku and Absolution. But like I said earlier, right? Skirk is not a character that uses Bennett. She doesn't have attack buffs in her base kit. She can have access to attack buffs on the team, TOM, Noblesse, TTDS, but it's a lot less than most other attack scalers, which means that she's not diluted in attack percent at all, which makes the base stat on Summit Shaper actually fine. Not really that much worse than a crit stat, and arguably better than a crit rate substat because it's not forcing you into a worse artifact set. And after that, what you have is a bit of attack percent from the passive. 20% attack if you're not shielded, 20% attack, pretty similar to those other weapons here, right? Pretty similar to 16 damage percent, pretty similar to 20 crit damage. But if you're shielded, it's doubled. That means if you're shielded, it's 40, and that's actually enough to make it more in line with Haran, Mistsplitter, and Jade Cutter. You shouldn't get Summit Shaper, okay? Like, it's a weapon that, because it's an attack percent weapon, it only works on attack scalers, and because it gives you a lot of attack percent, it's only good if you don't have a lot of attack externally. But attack scalers generally want a lot of attack externally. There are not that many characters that can properly use Summit Shaper, so you shouldn't just get the weapon just because it's decent. But if you are someone who pulled on Summit Shaper when it came out because you didn't know better, or you got a Summit Shaper on a loss 50-50, it's actually pretty much in line with the other 5-star stat stakes that are not her signature, if you're shielded. But even if you're not shielded, it's about as good as the craftable, so it's not bad to use either. Next up is Black Sword. But the biggest problem with Black Sword is just how good the craftable is. Because you're not diluted in attack percent, it means that the fact that Black Sword is a crit weapon isn't that favorable. And then on top of that, being a crit rate weapon specifically means potential overcapping on crit. And that makes Black Sword honestly just not very good. It can be nice to have a bit of healing, I guess, but I wouldn't really recommend using it. Next is Wolf Fang, and Wolf Fang, obviously, is gonna be bad when you're doing the normal attack mode, but is gonna be pretty decent when you're doing the burst mode, because it buffs burst damage. Even in the burst mode though, it needs refines to be better than the craftable. Next is the GOAT. You thought Finale of the Deep Galleries was good on Skirk? No, no, no. Cut off that Galleries, okay? Go away. Finale of the Deep is where it's at. Finale of the Deep is just a really good weapon. The amount of stats that it gives you is insane for craftable, right? You get 24% attack and then an additional amount of flat attack that's generally going to be around somewhere between 220 and 250. It's based off of Skirk's total HP, but you don't want to go out of your way to get HP. And then because her base attack is going to be at around 900 with this, the equivalent of a little more than another 24% attack. So you basically get the equivalent of a little bit more than 50% attack from this passive. That's more than what you get from Summit Shaper when you're shielded. Now, it's a 4-star, so it's lower base attack, so it's not a better weapon than Summit Shaper when you're shielded, but it's a very large amount of attack. And like I said, because your attack is not that diluted to begin with, Finale's really good. If you don't go for her signature, Skirk's best 5-star stat stick is gonna be less than 15% better than Finale. Finale is doing a lot. But it's not even her best free-to-play weapon. I said best in slot free-to-play, but that's actually a lie. Her best in slot free-to-play weapon is actually Calamity of Eshu. Eshu is giving you even more. But this is an event weapon, so not everyone has it, and it's also a conditional weapon. It only buffs normal and charge attack damage, which is fine for Skirk, but it does mean that when you use the burst, that doesn't get buffed. But more importantly, it only works when you're shielded. Not when you have a shielder on your team, but when you are shielded. That means if your shield breaks, you don't get the Eshu bonus anymore. If it doesn't break, though, Eshu is actually about as good as the 5-star stat sticks. Like, it's within 1% of Mistsplitter. Now, the biggest problem is that unlike Summit Shaper, that is still a pretty solid weapon if you lose your shield, Eshu loses the whole ass passive when you lose your shield. And so if you're playing with a shielder that doesn't have a particularly big shield like Citlali, you're gonna have to make sure you don't get hit. Finally, quick mention for Harbinger of Dawn. People are under the impression that Harbinger of Dawn is a great weapon as long as you maintain above 90%, which is kind of true. But the reality is that a 3-star weapon stat line is much, much lower. What makes Harbinger of Dawn still good is that it's a medium base attack for a 3-star with most of its strength being on the very strong crit rate passive. And that makes it so that when you have a lot of flat attack buffs, the lower base attack doesn't really matter as much. But as I've mentioned many, many times already, you don't get a lot of flat attack buffs in these Skirk teams. You don't have Bennett, you don't have Eon San. You also don't get transformative reactions that look at your crit value, but not at your attack, like Alhaitham does. And you're not an HP scaler that doesn't care about the base attack, like Furina. What that means is that even with 100% uptime, Harbinger is actually noticeably worse than Finale. So you should not use Harbinger. You might be wondering, why didn't I say Sturdy Bone? Sturdy Bone is a direct motion value weapon. What that means is that it's good on characters that have low motion values and high stats. And as I mentioned earlier, Skirk is the other way around. She has high motion value and low stats. Sturdy Bone is actually worse than Finale of the Deep. R5 Sturdy Bone is similar to R1 Finale of the Deep. Don't use this weapon. Next is artifact sets. Marie-José is her generic best in slot because 36 crit rate plus 15 normal damage percent is just better than 75 damage percent. But that's assuming you're able to proc it, so it's only if you have Furina. And it's assuming you're not overcapping, which means it might cause some issues on crit rate weapons. And worth mentioning, her signature weapon is a crit rate weapon. It's low crit rate, right? Low substat, high base attack, but still, at a baseline with her signature, if you've got Prior Resonance, on Marie-José, you're starting at 78. Now, this amount of crit rate, it is possible to not overcap while still having a good set, but it's a lot less likely. It makes it so that piece like this, for example, amazing piece, but if I wanted to use Skirk on a crit rate weapon, I get over half of the crit rate that I'm allowed to have before I overcap in only one of my 5 pieces. And then the circlet won't be able to have crit damage on the substat, so it'll only be able to have crit rate and attack. So I probably have a bunch of my crit rate there too. And then that means that crit rate on any other pieces is effectively just wasted rolls. It is possible, but generally your artifact quality in something like this is going to end up worse. And it might be worse enough that using the signature set, despite it being a little bit behind, will be better. Does that mean I would recommend using the signature set? Honestly, unfortunately, no. There is a major problem with the signature set. When the equipping character has 0 elemental energy, normal and burst damage increase by 60%. So far, so good. After the equipping character deals normal attack damage, the burst effect will stop applying for 6 seconds. Not a problem. You never burst right after normal attacks. But after the equipping character deals elemental burst damage, the aforementioned normal attack effect will stop applying for 6 seconds. Here's the problem. That really strong first rotation that I've talked about you being able to use on your first chamber, when you do that, you burst and then you immediately follow that up with your skill. And if that's what you do, then the first 6 seconds of your skill uptime do not have a 4-piece. And instead of 60%, it's 60% to half of your uptime, so it's like 30%. And at that point, this is a lot worse. Maréchaussée 2-piece does not apply to the burst, but you can get the crit rate from Maréchaussée for the burst. And because of that, even if you don't get all 3 stacks, even if you only end up getting 2 stacks of Maréchaussée, which is generally pretty easy because you swap into Skirk, consume HP once, use your burst, heal up from Escoffier's healing over time, that's already 2 stacks. You don't really have to change your rotation and wait to stack it up for 2 stacks out of 3. Even at just 2 stacks, Maréchaussée is already better, despite the burst not gaining anything from the 15 damage percent. Does that change with vertical investment? Kind of, because her signature weapon is a crit rate weapon, which makes Maréchaussée worse. But also, C1, this damage is considered charge attack damage, so it doesn't get buffed by the set. That being said, if you're not doing normal attacks, you just do burst mode, burst, focused, carry, Skirk, her best in slot is the gallery set. Technically, best in slot against freezable enemies is Blizzard Sprayer, but who cares? There's too many unfreezable enemies, and against unfreezable enemies, Blizzard Sprayer, even with full uptime on the Cryo, is already a lot worse than Maréchaussée. And if you have off-field Hydro App with like Yelan or something, it's just pretty dog shit. Another thing to keep in mind is that so far I've talked about her crit stuff, assuming you have Cryo Resonance. And you'll always get Cryo Resonance, but you won't always get good uptime on the Cryo Resonance. If you're using a character like Yelan, for example, or Xingqiu, when you're against unfreezable enemies, you'll end up with very little, if any, uptime on Cryo Auras on enemies. And that means you're basically getting no crit rate from the Cryo Resonance. And at that point, you're not really going to be overcapping with Maréchaussée, unless you're using a really high crit rate weapon like Jade Cutter. Does that mean you can't use her signature set? No, it does not. As much as it's a lot worse when you do the like roided out rotation with burst plus normal attacks, it's still not bad, and your burst itself, which is going to be your front-loaded damage, does get the full value from the set. On top of that, your gallery set will function on any weapon, whether they're crit rate or crit damage, so you won't have to switch out your build depending on the situation. It works even if you don't have Furina available. It's better when you do burst only. And so, if you just want to have one Skirk build that you can use in every Skirk team, it's fine to go for galleries. But the reason why it's very important and impactful that Maréchaussée is actually often better than her signature set isn't because you should farm Maréchaussée instead of farming galleries. It's because if you're not playing Verissa or Xiao, the second set available in the galleries domain is worthless to you, most likely. On top of that, there were so many characters that were released since Maréchaussée came out that want to use Maréchaussée. That means that anyone who started playing in or before Fontaine probably spent many months of resin in the Maréchaussée domain already, and so a lot of people already have some pretty good Maréchaussée pieces. Is it worth farming a whole new domain for a situational upgrade that's often not even an upgrade? Hell no. You're much better off farming for something else if you're not an incredibly dedicated main. And because Maréchaussée is such a good set overall, and to be fair, so is Golden Troop, a lot of people are already going to have good sets, and for them, farming galleries is really just a luxury thing. You can do it if you want, but it's far from necessary. What are your other set options? Ideally, you want sets that buff her normal attacks. Well, there's gonna be Blizzard Sprayer, right? Obviously, Blizzard Sprayer gives you even more stats than Maréchaussée does, but it's a lot more conditional. Against bosses, it's impossible to get the full 40 crit. You cap at 20, and in practice, it's gonna be less than 20. And that's already enough to make it worse than galleries. Even if you got full uptime on the enemies affected by Cryo Blizzard Sprayer, if they're not frozen, it's worse than Galleries, and pretty noticeably so. And so, if you already have an insane Blizzard Sprayer because you've been an Ayaka main for years, you can use that. But if that's not the case, Blizzard Sprayer is not the set you should farm for. What else? She's a character who opens her rotations with Burst, and who often wants to be played with Furina, which is why Marital says good. That means that Vermilion is actually also gonna be a viable set. Worse, but viable. If you have been a Xiao main for a long time, you already have an insane Vermilion set, you'll be able to use it on her. Glad, 35 damage percent, 18 attack, not bad. Echoes is bad. The value of Echoes is similar to what you have on Sturdy Bone, right? I already talked about why Sturdy Bone isn't that good. Echoes is similar. What you effectively get is just more motion value, but if your characters already have really high motion value, it's just not that good. And the last one I want to talk about is one that I think a lot of people didn't think about, is DPC, Desert Pavilion Chronicle. When charge attacks hit opponents, the equipping character's normal attack speed will be increased by 10%, and normal charge and plunge attack damage will be increased by 40%. Now, one thing you might have noticed is if you have C1, you now have a noticeable source of charge attack damage. And for Signature Set and Glad, don't buff that. DPC does. 40 damage percent is a lot worse than 75, and it's also actually worse than 35 damage percent and 18% attack. But attack speed can be useful on Skirk. And now we have to talk about attack speed. The value of attack speed is going to depend on how good you are, but I don't even know if attack speed is better if you're good or if you're bad yet, because I need to test the combos before I'm confident in that. Attack speed gets you more attacks, and depending on how many more attacks you get, it can range from very good to very bad. On top of that, you need to do a charge attack to proc it, so you have to open up your rotation with a charge attack before you use your skill, which slightly extends your setup. You don't have to do that if you have C1, because the C1 explosion from using the special burst right after your skill is gonna activate the effect. This set is probably a pretty reasonable option for people that go C1R1, where Marichal won't work properly because you'll overcap crit, because your R1 is crit rate, but also Galleries won't work properly because of C1. But honestly, I wouldn't say you should farm it over the other options, even if you do end up going C1R1. It's just mostly if you already have a DPC because you've played a lot of Wanderer, or you got really unlucky on the flop domain and you stayed in there for 6 months. I'm not saying that you should farm for this. Honestly, out of these sets, the only two that you should consider farming for Skirk are these two. The other four are mainly just if you already have a good set on them, you can use it. Also keep in mind, the DPC set does not buff burst damage, which means that when you do those roided out rotations with burst and normal attack uptime, DPC becomes a lot worse than the sets that are more generic. Next up is artifact stats. So obviously, default, attack, cryo, crit. However, like we've already mentioned many a times already throughout this pre-release, she doesn't have that much attack percent. Now, a lot of her weapon options are capitalizing on that already, right? Like Finale, you get a ton of attack from that. But if you're using a weapon that doesn't give you a lot of attack percent, if you're using Calamity of Eshu, where you get a bit of attack percent from the substat, but mostly damage percent and crit from the passive. Or if you're using Haran, that gives you a lot of damage percent, and that makes it hard not to overcap on Maréchal, so you generally switch to Galleries, and you get a ton more damage percent from that. Well, now you're starting to dilute your damage percent even more. And if you on top of that are running Furina, and then either Cinder City or Yelan or something like that, you end up with so much damage percent and not that much attack, which makes it so that attack, crit is actually often competitive and sometimes better. From what I've calced, by default, Attack Goblet is slightly better on Haran, and it's pretty much the only situation where it's like better enough that like I would actively go out of my way to find an Attack Goblet. And then on all the other weapons, it's either noticeably worse if you have a lot of attack already, like on Finale, or pretty similar if you don't have that much of either, like on Uraku, Misugiri, on these LoFi Splendor, whatever. On Jade Cutter, it's fairly similar. Mistsplitter, it's fairly similar. I would generally pretty much never consider attack circlet. I mean, technically you can consider attack circlet. You can do like attack cryo attack if you have a really good attack circlet and very little attack and subs, but it's generally not going to be all that great. At the end of the day though, if you have an insanely good attack circlet, put it in the optimizer, it might turn out to be better. Finally, teams. We will quickly talk about the non-freeze teams. If you want to force Skirk into a non-freeze team, you can either try to go Melt, or you can just use her like as a random ass unit in like Hyper Bloom, for example. The best versions of Melt and of Hyper Bloom that I've calced are worse than the worst versions of Freeze that I've calced. So unless you just really like the color green, you shouldn't play Skirk Bloom. And yeah, we're coining the term Skirk Bloom. You can't make me change it. It's too late. And similarly, unless you really like the color red, you shouldn't use Melt Skirk either. And then within freeze teams, you also shouldn't use any non-cryo or hydro unit. You can use Skirk as a burst support in teams that don't have the stuff that's all that favorable to her, but it's generally not gonna be better than using other alternatives, so I would generally stay away from that. So, what are the things to keep in mind for her freeze teams? Well, there's Escoffier and there's Furina. Here's the thing. Her best teams are going to be Escoffier, Furina, Flex, and there is barely any difference between the best, like, 5 Flex options. It's like a 5% difference between the best of the 5 to the worst of the 5. What that means is that as long as you have Escoffier and Furina, you pretty much have the best available Skirk team, no matter which one of the 5 last slots you're using. But if you don't have Escoffier, or if you don't have Furina, things can change. Escoffier is just the whole package, but the thing is, an important part of that whole package is the fact that she's a healer. And what that means is that if you have Escoffier but you don't have Furina, the value you get from Escoffier isn't as much. If you think of someone who has Escoffier and Furina, and then whatever of the good 4th slots, as 100% of Skirk's potential. What happens if you're missing these units? If you don't have Escoffier, you have 2 options. Either use Furina with a bad healer, or don't use Furina and don't use a healer. And the difference between those two is very small. Being forced to use Mika or Charlotte versus just ditching the Furina and doing double Hydro with like Xingqiu Yelan plus Citlali or something, there's honestly barely a difference. So if you don't have Escoffier, Furina doesn't really do that much for you. From what I've looked at, and I haven't calculated every single possible teams, but I've looked at a bunch of them. The best non-Escoffier team with Furina that I had was at like a little bit over 70% of her full potential. And the best team I had that didn't have Escoffier and that also didn't use Furina was just a little bit under 70%. So really barely a difference between having Furina or not if you don't have Escoffier. The same cannot be said the other way around. If you don't have Furina, Escoffier is still a noticeable upgrade, but it's still pretty noticeably behind having both of them. If you have Escoffier but you don't have Furina, from what I've looked at, it seems like you're a little bit north of 80%. And then if you have both, you're at 100%. What that means is that if you don't have Escoffier, Skirk is a lot worse. I wouldn't say that she's a bad character though, because of her ability, like I mentioned earlier, to do that roided out rotation with burst plus normal attacks. She can still cheat out enough damage to be fairly strong, but it will be a lot weaker than in her like premium teams. From what I've looked at, her damage, even without the roided out rotation in the premium team, it's up there competing with like Verissa, competing with like hypothetical everything goes right Gumming, a little bit under that, but like not that far behind. It's not Mika, but it's on the like next step basically. Without Escoffier, you're barely passing the Hyper Bloom check. The reality is that a team that passes the Hyper Bloom check is gonna be able to clear pretty much any content in the game as long as it's not getting countered by the content. Like, you're obviously not clearing the Lava Dragon with a Skirk team. But you should be fine clearing things. But I don't know if it'll actually be strong enough to clear the new, like the new endgame mode. It seems to have HP pools balanced around you being stronger than what you need to be for Abyss 12. And I don't know if a well-built Skirk in a team that doesn't have Escoffier will actually be able to clear in time. But Skirk will not be the only character that is going to run into that issue. There's not going to be that many characters that are going to be able to comfortably clear the new mode outside of their best teams. Very often, when it comes to characters that have one team that's better than the alternatives, like just in terms of that specific team's damage, getting a signature or a constellation on your carry is often better than getting the best possible support. For example, just in terms of DPS, R1 Mika with Rosaria or with Kaya is better than R0 Mika with Citlali. There's a lot of quality of life stuff that Citlali provides, but just in terms of DPS, I mean. For Skirk, that's not the case. There is no Constellation or signature weapon that will do more for your team than obtaining Escoffier and or Furina. So if you're someone who started playing somewhat recently and is considering vertical investment in teams, I would recommend getting these characters over getting Constellations. Now we can talk about those last slot options. And like I said earlier, there's really not that much difference between many of the strong ones. There are no 4-stars here, but the gap between Yelan and like Xingqiu, for example, isn't that big. They each have their respective upsides and downsides, so let's go through them. Citlali. Upside, you get a shield, and that shield allows you to use eshu, which is very good. But if you don't have eshu because you missed the event, or you have Mistsplitter or her sig, or you get hit like an idiot and you lose the eshu passive, Citlali loses value. One thing you might not have thought of is Citlali actually struggles to get Cinder City to proc if you try to give her TDDS for Skirk. Because in order to give Skirk the TDDS, you have to swap from Citlali to Skirk, and Skirk is your carry, so you want to swap to her last. That means you got to swap to Escoffier and Furina first. But if you do Furina into Escoffier to get your fanfare from Escoffier's burst, your aura's cooked. You're not getting an underlying Hydro to trigger freeze with Citlali to get that 40 damage %. What that means is that in practice, the best thing that I've looked at is either take the L, give Citlali another set on TDDS, or take the L, give Citlali another weapon on Cinder City and swap to her before Escoffier. If you could get both, that paired with Eshu being better than Finale would arguably make Citlali the best one, but unfortunately, it's kind of cooked. Next option is Yelan. Yelan upside, you get personal damage from her, which makes it even easier to kill an enemy without needing Skirk uptime to set up a roided out rotation for the next chamber. It's also pretty comfortable to play. You have more damage coming outside of your carry, so if you up, if you get hit, whatever, and you lose damage in your uptime because of that, it's not as big of a deal. Yelan downside, when you're not against freezable enemies, when you're against bosses, Yelan is gonna make it so you pretty much have very little, if any, cryo resonance uptime. And so numbers wise, against bosses, it will be worse. Next up is Shenhe. Shenhe upside, you do get full cryo resonance or not, or close to it. You get a bit of shred, you get a lot of useful stuff. Downside is that Shenhe's numbers are just pretty bad, and so despite being a pretty solid option, she's not providing you with that much. On top of that, her quills only work in single target, so when you're in AoE content, she becomes worse. And I think the biggest downside for Shenhe is that she's the only unit on this list that's pretty worthless outside of freeze teams. And so if you're considering which one to get, unless you know you'll main Skirk and only ever play her for the rest of your life, she's the one that provides the least value to your account. Yeah, another upside, what I talked about earlier when we looked at the boss, additional cryo application helps you with this specific boss more. But yeah, another downside with Shenhe is that the hold skill is a lot worse than the tap skill on her. It effectively means that instead of, in Ayaka teams, you get 10 quills per 20-second rotation. That's a quill every 2 seconds. In Skirk teams, you get 7 quills per 22-second rotation, which is like 1 quill per 3 seconds. And then on top of that, in Ayaka teams, you get to buff with your damage %, both Escoffier and Ayaka. And with Skirk, you have to choose either the hold for normal buff or the tap for skill buff. I haven't looked that much in the hybrid 30-second rotations with Shenhe, where you do tap skill, burst, and then hold skill, normal attack uptime. But I'm not too optimistic about it because in a team like that, you also run into issues with Shenhe's burst not having good uptime. Keep in mind, the stat buffs that Shenhe provides, the 15 cryo damage from Ascension 1 is only for the 12 seconds of burst duration, and same for the cryo shred you get. Shenhe is actually a fairly low uptime character for buffs, and so in those hybrid rotations, you get a lot less uptime on them. Despite all those issues, Shenhe is still pretty strong and competitive with the other options here. That leaves us with the last two, Mualani and Mona. Mona is the weakest one of these 5, but as a standard character, there's a bunch of people that have cons on her, and if you have her C4, she's actually the strongest one, or close to it. In general, Mona has a pretty big issue, which is that her ER requirements are really, really high, often to the point where it's impossible to reach the ER you need without an ER weapon. That being said, that's heavily alleviated by being played with another Hydro unit. And so in these Escoffier teams that often run 2 Hydro units, like with Furina, Mona's ER requirements can be reached without an ER weapon. And that opens up the possibility of using Mona with TTDS. Now, Mona gives 60 damage percent with her Omen, plus 48% attack from TTDS, plus 20% attack from Noblesse. That's actually a lot of stats. Problem is, Omen duration is only 5 seconds. In freeze teams, you can extend the Omen duration to more than 5 seconds. Omen duration, the way that it works is that the duration doesn't start ticking down until you pop the bubble, right? The burst applies a mark, and then when you hit an enemy, it pops the bubble, and then the Omen duration starts. But before the bubble pops, you still have the 60 damage percent, not just after it pops. The thing is that the bubble doesn't actually pop when you deal damage. It pops when enemies take poise damage. When enemies receive an attack that can stagger them. Even if the attack doesn't stagger them, if it has the ability to stagger them, it will pop the bubble. That's why there's a few select abilities that do not pop Mona's bubble despite dealing damage. So you can see the bubble hasn't popped yet. The Constellation is still there. We haven't dealt the damage. And it'll pop just because it expires around now. There it is. And this is when the duration starts. Thing is, frozen enemies are immune to poise damage. That means that as long as the enemies don't get unfrozen, that bubble pop gets delayed until the freeze expires. Which means that in freeze teams, against freezable enemies, you get to extend that Omen duration to more than 5 seconds. From what I've looked at, and obviously I can't test it with Skirk, because Skirk's not out yet, but I've tested it using cryo normal attack on fielders like Charlotte. It seems like you can pretty reliably get 2 to 3 seconds of Omen uptime extension. How good is that in practice? Well, it effectively means that you're getting about half of your uptime with the buff instead of closer to a third. It's not that big of a difference, but it's a nice little thing. Mona's C4 gives you crit rate while that Omen is active. Now, this is not actually 15 crit rate overall because it's only while the Omen is active and the Omen doesn't have 100% uptime. But it's still a little bit of crit rate. A little bit of additional stats. You love to see it. You might be thinking, ooh, frozen duration extension. No, this is bugged. Mona's C1 has actually never helped frozen duration. It does not do anything and it never has. I know that some people were under the impression that it does because at some point I saw a post on Reddit that says, no, Mona C1 actually works and here's the proof. And they had footage of freeze duration being longer with Mona's C1, but what it actually was the freeze duration being longer because they triggered freeze with a 2U aura instead of a 1U aura. They weren't comparing the same order of abilities with C1 and without it. They were comparing a different order of abilities. That's what made the freeze duration bigger. But yeah, no, this outright just does not do anything. The other parts work, right? It does increase vape damage. It does not increase freeze duration. Honestly though, even if it did, it wouldn't really matter. Even despite that 15% crit rate not having great uptime, because the characters are already so close together, it's actually enough to bring her from the bottom of the 5 to the top of the 5. But the biggest upside to Mona, out of these 5, is that she's a standard character, so a lot of people will have her without having to specifically pull for her, and if you're new, you'll be able to get her from the selector if you want, on the anniversary. Not that I'd necessarily recommend that. For long-term stuff, Mona's not that great, and there's a couple standard characters that have great constellations and that become actually decent units with them, but it's an option for you at least. Compared to the other characters here, one of the nicest things about Mona is that because her buff is very front-loaded, when you do the roided out rotation with the burst, that burst is gonna hurt a lot. And generally, it'll hurt more than with any other units you could be using. So for speedrunning, and just front-loaded damage in general, Mona can sometimes perform slightly better than she calcs. And finally, we have Mualani. I don't know if I'm supposed to hate it or love it. I like it when characters have multiple potential roles, especially ones where it doesn't feel like they were explicitly designed for it. But I also feel like Mualani being usable here is just a result of Cinder City being way too good. It's a mix of two things, actually. It's a result of Cinder City being way too good, but also a result of just not having a great last slot for this team. The reason why there's so many units that are close to one another in this team is because, honestly, none of them is that great. You're either playing units that have bad synergy or units that have bad numbers, and you kind of can't avoid that. The main thing that makes Mualani competitive with the other units is that it's not just that she has. She also actually has pretty good damage. When you go Cinder City, ER requirements become pretty trivial, and Mualani's burst is actually pretty good. Even when you don't vape it, it's pretty decent. And so if you go Mualani, use your skill, use a normal attack instantly to generate your particles, and then burst, and then immediately swamp out. She's actually pretty alright. And on top of that, what's the biggest downside of TTDS in general? It's that the substat doesn't really increase your damage. It's a good support weapon, but it's not a good weapon for your damage. Guess what stat Mualani scales with? That's right, she scales with HP. And so, unironically, TDS isn't even that much worse than the other options for her personal damage. And because of that, sure, she's not going to end up being the main source of damage on your team, but her burst is going to do, like, if you have her on a pretty decent build. Okay, bro. Alright, burst does a chill little 150k, 140k, 150k. It's nothing insane, but it does give you something that you can do during your downtime that's actually worth doing. And that was with pretty shit fanfare because first rotation stuff and we didn't consume any HP. And that makes it so that Mualani ends up having DPS that's high 4 digits, low 5 digits, depending on the specific setup, which is actually enough to make up for the gap in her buffing capability between what she gives and what a character like Mona gives, for example. Here's the real kicker, though. Mualani is not just good as a support in the Skirk carry teams. She's also good as an on-fielder to spend your time on when you do burst Skirk. I did a lot of calcs on a bunch of different teams, and I actually had quick swap Skirk with Mualani pretty damn close to these, like, Skirk carry teams. Is Mualani's best team just gonna be Skirk now? Yes. Okay? Yeah, I'm sorry. Unless you're a whale that's doing 300 more billion forward vape on the first skill. Yeah, her best team is just outright gonna be freeze now. Does that piss you off? It should! It is what it is, I suppose. Anyways, that's it for the 5 best last slots. Now, there is another last slot that I think is very powerful and arguably stronger than these, but very different. So let's talk about Neuvillette. Neuvillette's current best team is Escoffier, Citlali, Furina. The thing is, you're getting a lot of damage percent from Furina and a lot of shred from Escoffier, and you don't have a great target for TTDS, which means that Citlali, while she is giving you a lot of the things that the team wants, they're all things that are already pretty diluted. And so the value that Citlali gives you in a team like this is fairly small, all things considered. And as it turns out, Skirk is better. One major upside that Quick Swap Skirk has in general is that her damage is actually properly AoE. The AoE of her burst is much bigger than the AoE of Ayaka's burst, and it's also a lot bigger than her normal attack's AoE. And obviously, if you play her specifically in a Neuvillette team, that's also AoE stuff pretty clearly. If you're playing Quick Swap Skirk, Neuvillette is one of your stronger options, and obviously, because you're playing Neuvillette, you've got a lot of Neuvillette's quality of life upsides. Just in terms of numbers, Skirk's best team does not use Neuvillette, but the added quality of life makes a pretty compelling argument for her best team being the one where you use her as a quick swap support with Neuvillette. That being said, obviously, that scales a lot less well with vertical investment than a team where you have multiple characters buffing her damage. If you go C1R1, for example, you'll get a lot more value using buffers than characters that deal damage themselves without buffing her. Does Neuvillette go TTDS in this team? It's one of his options. From what I've looked at, TTDS is kind of just better than Amber. Using Skirk forces you into 30-second rotations instead of the lower limit of 24, 25, because you want to use Skirk off cooldown, so you use it every 15 seconds, like no matter what. But that means you only get TTDS every other burst. It's not that great, but like, it's still pretty good. After these 6 characters, you get into the ones that are arguably worse. But, like I've already mentioned, the gap between whatever character is best here based off of the specific content you're fighting and what you have, and the best, like, free-to-play available options, it's gonna be, like, at most around 10%. But yeah, so next, Xingqiu. Xingqiu is gonna be your best, like, free-to-play alternative if you don't have any of these. Xingqiu's pretty close to C0 Mona, but that's assuming you adjust his build properly, because in these teams, his ER requirements are quite a bit lower, and assuming he's got a proper build. And I know a lot of people have their Xingqiu on throwaway builds, but if that's the case for you, then he won't be as good as a buffer. And Xingqiu's like pretty neatly in the middle, in between those 5 / if you include Neuvillette 6 best slots, and the like options below. And those options below, you've got Chongyun. Chongyun is surprisingly decent, because if you go sack Chongyun, you get to use his skill twice in quick succession, and using the second skill makes the first skill expire, and with his Ascension 4 passive, that reduces cryo resistance for 8 seconds by 10%. It's a nice little thing. But also, Chongyun's skill does surprisingly reasonable damage on the cast, especially because the Ascension 4 makes it hit twice, and with Sack it hits 4 times. Alright, at talent level 13, because you've got Skirk's thing increasing it, it's 3600 motion value, and it happens 4 times. Right? So it's chill little around 1400. That plus the burst. It's not insane, but it's not awful either. Pair that with a little bit of attack speed that might help you get an additional 1 or 2 attacks out, and he's pretty reasonable. Mika! Mika gives you attack speed, and that's pretty much it. If you're playing Escoffier, you already have healing. So all you really get from Mika is attack speed. And like I said earlier, attack speed is kind of hard to evaluate before I do proper testing. But for now, also kind of a reasonable 4th. Dahlia is just going to be slightly better than Mika, assuming you have cons on him. At C6, Dahlia provides a little bit more attack speed than Mika does. And then on top of that, you get a shield, so you get to use Eshu if you have it. And then on top of that, Dahlia's shield refreshes itself when it breaks. It's not the biggest shield, but it refreshes itself when it breaks. So getting good uptime on Eshu is very, very easy. We're not going to talk too much about Dahlia's kit in here. All you need to know is his shield kind of works like Baiju, where like he reapplies the shield to himself. But instead of it being every X amount of seconds, it just does it automatically when it breaks, up to 5 times. So you get really good shield uptime, as long as you don't get hit too many times. Unlike Mika, Dahlia is burst reliant for his attack speed though. Both of them you'd run on Noblesse if you use them, so you still want to use Mika's burst. But if something goes wrong with your energy, with Mika you still get the attack speed, with Dahlia you get nothing. Rosaria, also a reasonable 4th. Her personal damage is pretty low in these teams, but she's got decent energy generation to help your Escoffier and Furina ER requirements, and a bit of a crit rate buff, which can be nice. Ayaka, with Ayaka, you can either do burst Skirk and spend field time on Ayaka, or you can do normal attack Skirk and just burst on Ayaka every rotation. And from what I've looked at, both of those seem fairly similar. I haven't looked at hybrid Skirk with Ayaka yet. Maybe it's better, but I'm not sure. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is Skirk's energy generation. We've talked about the Serpent Subtlety generation, but just because Skirk doesn't use energy doesn't mean energy doesn't matter. The rest of your team still has burst costs. Skirk generates 4 cryo particles whenever she deals cryo damage with a cooldown. What that means is that if you use her in the burst mode, she just generates particles whenever you burst. And if you use her in the normal attack mode, she generates particle at the start of your normal attack uptime. Cooldown on it is 15 seconds, so you'll get it on every burst, and you'll only get it once per normal attack uptime. One kind of funny / sad little fact is that despite Skirk not being energy reliant at all, very often the best non-5-star weapon options for the supports in her teams are still going to be Fav, just because the supports themselves benefit so much from Fav. Not just their energy requirements, but also their damage, because lower ER requirements mean higher non-ER stats. So there's quite a few teams where your best in slot option on your Furina is Fav, or on your Escoffier is Fav, or on your last slot is Fav. There's even a couple teams where you run triple Fav as your best 4-star weapon lineup. Anyways, next up, Candace. Candace gives you a bit of damage percent on normal attacks, and that's it. Ayato has a bit of personal damage with 20 normal attack damage. If you do like burst support Noblesse Ayato, it's okay. Kokomi, you can use either on TOM or on another support set. You can use CDDS. Ganyu as burst support. You have a bit of personal damage. You've got some cryo damage inside the burst. Layla, you get a shield for Eshu. You potentially get TOM. I think people are a bit overestimating Layla. Keep in mind, you already have someone on the team in Furina that can use TOM. And so Layla doesn't mean that you go from not being able to use TOM to being able to use TOM. It means that your Furina gains Golden Troop, which is generally less impactful than getting the TOM buff from not having it. But you're not getting Hydro Resonance, and her shield uptime is worth worse than Dahlia, and she doesn't give attack speed. So generally, Dahlia is just outright better. That's pretty much it. Like, there's others. You can use Kea, you can use Child. If you really want to do these things, you can do whatever you want. As a general rule, it's the 5 I've mentioned. Then there's like Neuvillette kind of in conjunction with that. Then it's like Xingqiu, and then it's like the rest. I've seen a lot of people talk about that 4th slot. At the end of the day, out of these 5, none of them is bad. They each have their respective upsides. If you have all of them and you're wondering which one you should use, I think that the optimal one will slightly depend on the scenario. Against bosses, I'd say probably Shenhe if you're against that new boss that wants Cryo App. Otherwise, probably Mualani. But if playing Mualani as a freeze support makes you feel icky, you don't have to play her. It's fine. You can play Mona. It won't be that different. If you don't have Furina, generally the off-field damage dealers are a little bit better than the buffers because the other buffers are kind of ass. So getting stuff like Xingqiu Yelan often better than using stuff like Candace, Mualani. Mualani's not that bad actually because she's got a bit of damage herself too. If you don't have Escoffier, your best bet is generally just gonna be Citlali, Xingqiu Yelan, generally gonna be what you want to go for. But it's honestly not that far ahead of the more like weird stuff with like Rosaria, Xingqiu, Dahlia. Really not that much worse. But yeah, I'm expecting pretty much everyone to agree that she is one of the 5 strongest carries when she comes out. Right now, most people would agree that the 4 strongest carries are these 4 characters. There's some people that are trying to sneak Ayaka in here, but I think that's gonna stop once Skirk comes out and people realize that it's not Ayaka that's good, it's just Escoffier that's doing everything. With, in my opinion, these 2 characters being the best 2, and these 2 characters being pretty close together, noticeably below. I think that Skirk is gonna be in this group more than in this group. I think she's an interesting middle ground in between Mika and Neuvillette, where she doesn't have Mika's DPS, but she actually kind of does on her first rotation, and at high investment, it can be possible for content to take 1 rotation. And unlike Mika, she gets to split her damage in 2 uptime windows on that first rotation with the burst and then the skill. So if the enemies have some stalling, you can just wait out that stalling, which is something Mika can't really do. But just in terms of DPS, she is going to be noticeably below. And then versus Neuvillette, she does more damage, but obviously the quality of life on any character is going to be worse than on Neuvillette. The thing is, though, in terms of compared to other carries, Skirk's quality of life is pretty good. Freeze is a very nice reaction to have against freezable enemies. It makes things so much more comfortable. If you ever played Freeze against a Wayob, you'll know. But also, her rotations are incredibly straightforward. Use your setup abilities and then spam normal attacks, and you'll get most of the value. Technically, dash cancels are worth using, but it's not the end of the world if you don't. The rotations on Neuvillette for optimal stuff tend to be a little bit more dank. I will still stand by Neuvillette being the best carry because I value the quality of life very highly. I don't think Skirk's going to change that. The biggest problem is going to be that her best teams want Furina, and so does Neuvillette's best team, which means if you already have Neuvillette, Skirk might not be that big of an upgrade to your teams, especially with next patch introducing 3-team content where you'll want to have 3 different teams. If that's the case for you, if you are someone who currently has an Escoffier and Neuvillette team and a Mika Melt or something like that, maybe it'll be better for you to get a unit that has a strong team that doesn't have overlap with these 2 than getting Skirk. Or you can just get Skirk to upgrade your Neuvillette team. Anyways, I don't like Skirk's design. I think that gameplay wise, she's kind of boring. I like that you can choose between burst and normal attack, and I like that there's going to be situations where you do a hybrid, a mix between the 2. But just the actual playstyle itself seems really boring. I'm tired of just normal attackers that aren't even reliant on reactions and like aura stuff. I think it's a little bit boring, but it is what it is. And I also think that like her reliance on Escoffier and Furina is just unnecessary. They didn't need to give her the Omega Multiplier passive for Escoffier to be her best team. It would have been her best team regardless. But Xilaodan being noticeably worse than Mika pisses me off, man. Like, I think you're going too far with that shit. That passive was not necessary. I would have preferred if that freeze reliance was through Void Rifts only being generated by freeze, and it would have given her a bit more flexibility. But oh well, it is what it is. That pretty much does it for the Skirk stuff. As much as I kind of hate her design, I'm kind of looking forward to her release. I think she'll be pretty fun to play. As usual, hope you learned a thing or two. Hope you enjoyed. Do all the good old YouTube stuff. Like, comment, subscribe. Keep in mind, this is all pre-release stuff. I haven't gotten around to testing her because she's not out yet. If you want opinions on Skirk once I'm more confident in what I think about her, keep an eye out for the first impressions video that I'll be posting the day after the patch. And later on, the post-release, once I've gotten around to testing her a decent amount, or I'll be talking about what I got right and wrong in this pre-release video. Yeah, that does it. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.